Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to this Oxford Libertarian Society event. Chandran Kukathas requires very little introduction, so I won't really say too much other than to say that he's the chair of political theory at the London School of Economics, and has written a large number of books in political philosophy, including Liberal Archipelago, which comes highly recommended. And this evening he's going to talk about G.A. Cohen's theory of justice. So.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Thank you to the Society for inviting me. I invited some people to speak here, myself in the same set of circumstances, but getting close to 30 years ago, so it's almost embarrassing. The title of my talk is actually The Labour Theory of Justice, and it's subtitled A Critique of G.A. Cohen. Could I just find it here? Is there anyone here who's familiar with Cohen's work? Yeah? Okay, so there are a few people who've read some of this material that I'll be engaging with. I'm not engaging with all of Cohen's recent work or recent arguments, but I'm particularly interested in one aspect of his work which comes out in his recent book, Rescuing Justice and Equality, and I'm interested really in the first half of that book, which to some extent brings together arguments that he's been making over the previous 15 to 20 years about justice and about markets, and in critique of Rawls and to some extent of libertarianism and Nozick. Again, I'm not going to address all of it, but I'm interested in some of it. Most of this recent work is concerned, he says, to rescue justice and equality. And if you're going to rescue something, he says, you've got to rescue from something. And what he wants to rescue it from is, in fact, the Rawlsian idea of justice, because he thinks that Rawls' conception of justice is, in part, not really a proper conception of justice, and part of the reason for that is that it too readily abandons equality. So what it gives you is, in fact, a kind of denuded understanding of justice, or a compromised understanding of justice. So at the heart of Cohen's view is a kind of conception of justice that sees it as something very tightly tied to equality. He roughly thinks that if your circumstances in life are the product of bad luck rather than of your own efforts, then your misfortune is a matter of injustice. And for many people, the inequalities that they labour under, their relative poorness of condition compared to others, is therefore a matter of justice. So underlying this then is the view that even justifiable inequality is unjust. There may be reasons why inequalities may be necessary in society. Cohen's prepared to concede this, but he wants to say nonetheless that this is unjust. In fact, the only reasons he thinks that you can depart from justice, you can depart from equality without departing from justice, is if the departure from equality is not simply a reflection of your good fortune, but a reflection of your greater effort. Okay? Either you've put in more work, more hours, or you've engaged in more burdensome work. Then it's justifiable for you to reap greater rewards. This is why I've called this view about justice the labour theory of justice, because it in effect says that it's justifiable to reward people for greater labour, either the amount or the nature of the labour, but you don't really have a justification for rewarding people for being greater producers. Okay? It's because that, in the end, he seems to think, is largely a matter of luck. Okay? They have the good fortune to be better producers. So, what he wants to defend is a strongly egalitarian understanding of justice. So the obvious question to ask, or at least one obvious question to ask, is this possible? Okay? Is it possible to have this conception of justice extant in the real world? Well, Cohen thinks it is, but he thinks that there is a problem. Okay? That is to say, there's a problem because what he wants to see is three things instantiated in the world. Firstly, justice understood as equality of outcome. Secondly, he wants this to happen in a world in which there is no forced labour. Okay? So you couldn't achieve it by pushing people into occupations that they don't want to go into. And thirdly, he thinks it's important that this be achieved without a substantial drop in living standards. Okay? If it were the case that you could have justice understood as equality, but the price would be that everyone's standard of living drops dramatically, then this would hardly be worth gaining. Okay? So one of his questions is, can we have all these three things? This is the trilemma, in effect. Okay? Can we have equality, freedom of occupation, and a standard of living that doesn't drop as a result of trying to preserve these other two things? And his answer is it's going to be yes. Okay? Now, bear in mind again that he wants to say that the answer is yes, but we can achieve all of this without departing from income equality, because this is the path that he thinks that Rawls has taken in developing his theory of justice, and he thinks that this is a mistake. Okay? Let me say a little bit more then about these three desiderata. Okay? Income equality, freedom of occupation, and then the preservation of a reasonable standard of living, or at least to see no drop in the standard of living. When Cohen defends income equality, he thinks that this is a matter that's a matter of justice. Departures from income equality are only justifiable if it's a product of greater effort that people are being rewarded. It's also justifiable for people to be rewarded for more burdensome work, but it's not permissible to reward people more generously if they're more productive, and it's not justifiable to reward people more highly in order to induce them to produce more. And you might induce them to produce more by rewarding them more highly, either because the greater rewards make them work harder, or because the greater rewards make them go into more productive occupations. Okay? He says this is not permissible. These are not justifications for departing from equality. When it comes to freedom of occupation, Cohen's view again is fairly straightforward. Forced labour is unacceptable because it violates freedom. Okay? So he holds freedom very dear. Okay? Even though he thinks that it would be wrong for someone to refuse to labour unless given extra compensation. Okay? The only reason it would be permissible to decline to go into more productive labour is if you're engaged in the pursuit of self-realisation. Okay? If you're in the pursuit of self-realisation, then you might choose less productive but more fulfilling work, or you might choose more leisure, but you can't say that you'll only work harder or you'll go into more productive areas if you're more highly rewarded. He doesn't want to say you're not permitted to go into any area that you want. He wants to say there's freedom of occupation, but he thinks that morally speaking, you have no justification for insisting that you'll only go into a particular occupation if you're paid more. Okay? And thirdly, the requirement of the constant standard of living. He wants to say that a just society should not be one that buys equality by departing from, that buys equality by departing from the standard of living that it already enjoys, or forgoes the standard of living it could enjoy if it departed from equality. Okay? In other words, a just society should not be one that has to make great sacrifices in terms of the standard of living. So So the question is this possible? Okay? Well, Cohen thinks that it is, and he suggests that we think about two different societies and then a third one. Imagine the first society, okay, that is named fairly unimaginatively D1, or distribution 1. Okay? Now, in this society, the talented and the untalented enjoy complete income equality. Okay? No differences of effort and burden. So everyone has income equality in this particular society. Okay? And they have a certain standard of living. Now imagine another society, this one called D2, which is Pareto superior to D1. Okay? And what makes Pareto superior is that there are highest rewards given to those who are talented, which leads the talented to produce much more because they go into more productive occupations, they take more risks, they set up businesses, do all the things that create much greater wealth. Okay? But as a result, what we have now is inequality between the talented and the untalented. Now, both the talented and the untalented gain, but the talented gain more than the untalented. The talent here simply means, in this context, having the capacity to earn more income, okay, by productive work. So in this society D2, okay, you've moved there from D1 because you've rewarded the talented more highly, they become more productive, there's a greater net social product, but it's divided unequally. Everybody's gained, but the talented have gained even more. Okay? Now, Cohen doesn't really like D2, but what he says is that we can actually move to a distribution D3. Okay? Now, D3 is better than D1 because you have all of the social product that you find in D2. Everyone's worked in the occupations that produce the extra income. There's a larger total social product. The difference, however, is that all these gains are distributed more equally. That's the difference between D1 and D2. D2 is highly unequal, D3 is equal. There may be some minor variations due to some people taking on more burdensome work or taking on work that requires greater effort, more hours put in. But nonetheless, overall it's a much more egalitarian distribution. For the purposes of argument, let's just say it's a condition of complete equality amongst everyone. The talented have produced more, but everything is shared around. Now, is D3 possible? Okay. Well, what Cohen wants to say is that if it's possible to move from D1 to D2, then it is possible to move from D1 to D3. Okay? Because after all, you've got the same people there, they're still working, they're still doing all the same things that they're doing in D2 that they'd be doing in D3. The only thing that's different is the way in which the social product is distributed. So you don't actually need the changes in income distribution in order to produce a greater level of social product. People just have to recognize that if they go into the right enterprises, everyone will be better off, and there's no justification for them taking a larger slice of this social product just because they happen to be lucky enough to have the talents to make this possible. After all, these talents that they have, it's really just a matter of luck. The fact that some people don't have the talents is a matter of their poor luck, but they should not be asked to suffer a smaller, that is to say, an unequal share of the total social product just because some people are luckier. Okay? It would only be justified for some people to decline to go into these more productive enterprises, occupations and so on in D3 if their reason for doing it is that self-realization was their goal. They wouldn't have a case for doing so if they wanted to say, well, look, I'll only go into this if you're going to pay me more. Okay? That would be an unjustifiable reason. Okay? Now, what Cohen is trying to say here, of course, is that he recognizes that in the real world people respond to incentives. But what he wants to say is that the reason that D3 is possible is that we could have a world in which people weren't so motivated to respond to these incentives, which are essentially selfish incentives, responding to their own narrow interests rather than thinking about the welfare of the society as a whole. What we have here is a society in which the ethos of justice doesn't exist. But it could be made to exist, it could be brought about. And so the obstacle to moving to D3 is nothing practical about the real world, there's nothing about nature that stops us from getting to D3, it's just social attitudes. Okay? So if we had different social attitudes, we could get to this better situation.
Hi, I'm very sorry to interrupt, I'm not that familiar with Cohen's work personally. So he sets out his framework in opposition to like Rawls and Nozick, as opposed to, I mean, what would his position be?
Patrick, perhaps it's best if we wait till the question.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying at the moment actually just to try to give you a picture of the theory rather than defending it, and then I'm going to criticize it. So, let me go a little bit longer, and if it's still unclear to you, do raise your hand by all means, because I don't want it to sort of become hazy. But I don't mind taking the question. But let me just move on a little bit further to see if I can give you a kind of account of what he's trying to say. So, what he's trying to say is that the obstacle to getting to this third alternative is not something in the nature of the world itself. It's simply a product of social attitudes, okay? Which means that it is in principle possible to get a world in which we get a much higher standard of living, freedom of occupation, and at the same time egalitarian justice. Okay? And those who want to say, if I'm not going to get a higher share, I'm not going to do the extra work or go into those occupations that produce more for society as well as for myself, these people are unwarranted in doing this. Okay? And so what we need to do is to persuade them that thinking in this way is unjust. Okay? Now, why would thinking in this way be unjust? Okay? And why would it be wrong for them to think about this in this way? Okay? To think I should only act if I'm more seriously or more highly rewarded. Okay? Well, I don't know that Cohen gives us a great answer to this question, but he tries to give us an account of what the logic of his view is. Okay? So let me try to give you an account of what he's trying to argue here. Okay? He says, imagine that there's a person who has a couple of talents, okay? Who could be a doctor, but who's also a very, very keen gardener. Okay? Now, this person is willing to become a doctor if she earns, say, £50,000 a year. Seems like a fairly pitiful sum for a doctor these days, but that's maybe part of the charm of the theory. The second preference that this person has is to become a gardener. Sorry, if the pay for a gardener is only £20,000, she'd rather have £50,000 and be a doctor, but if only £20,000 is on offer, then she'd be a gardener. Her third preference is in fact to be a doctor for £20,000. So if only £20,000 is available, she'll become a gardener, because that's what she really prefers. Okay? Now, what Cohen wants to say is that in this circumstance, okay, this person should really become a doctor, okay? Because it's already clear from the fact that for £50,000 this person would choose doctoring over gardening, that this person will find being a doctor perfectly fulfilling. Okay? Otherwise, why would this person do it? So the only reason, in this example, this person is choosing to become a doctor is if she's paid an extra £30,000. So it's purely for the money. And what Cohen wants to say is that this is not a legitimate reason for choosing this profession, that you yourself gain this extra money. It's understandable if you do it because you find this work distasteful. It's understandable if you find this work burdensome in some way, if you find it doesn't contribute to your self-realization. But if your only motive is money, then he wants to say this is an illegitimate motivation, and it would be a just society that would tax away the £30,000 surplus that you could make as a doctor and redistribute it, because all you're really warranted in claiming is £20,000 in the first place. And this is what a just society would do. It would redistribute this surplus. Okay? Now, what Cohen is really saying here is that this person who says, well, if I'm only going to be paid £20,000, I'm just going to become a gardener. This person doesn't really prefer to garden. This person really just wants the money. What he's doing is really calling into question the motives of this person. Now, what I want to ask here is that there seems to be a problem in this particular claim that Cohen is making. Because what he's saying is that this person who refuses to go on to become a doctor unless given an extra £30,000 is no better than an extortionist. Okay? I'm just going to stay at home, grow my roses, sell them to the market garden, make a little bit of money. When I could be doing something so much more productive for society, why am I not doing this? Why am I not doing something that's so much better for the society as a whole? Not because I don't feel that it's fulfilling. I would. I mean, that's why, if I was paid more money, I would do it. I'm doing it because what I really want is more money. Okay? I'm holding out. And this, he thinks, is an unacceptable way of behaving. But what I wonder is that, is this the right way to see this person's behavior? And here's another way of looking at it. This person really loves gardening. Okay? Doesn't really love doctoring. In fact, it would take an extra £30,000 to get her to change her mind to become a doctor. Okay? If it's anything less than another £30,000, this person would rather just be a gardener. So she doesn't really like doctoring nearly as much as she likes gardening. It would take an awful lot to make her change her mind. But for Cohen, the way his argument is structured, really, if you are willing to do something at some higher price, that means that you should be willing to do it really for a much lower price. And this seems implausible. I mean, think about it in this way. What he's in effect saying is that unless you're someone who says, I wouldn't take that other alternative for all the money in the world, you're really just an extortionist. That doesn't show that you really don't want to do this thing. What it shows is that you're an extortionist. But this seems like an implausible way of thinking about people's motivation. So I wonder about the idea here of saying that we should think about people's motivations in this very, very peculiar way that he wants to suggest. Okay, so this is one of my concerns about Cohen's attempt to argue that moving from D1 to D3 is feasible. Okay? And what he wants to say is that it's not feasible to move from D1 to D3 if people are motivated by personal gain. What he wants to criticize is the idea that people should think it reasonable to be motivated just by personal gain. But in fact, for as long as people are just motivated by personal gain, we'll never be able to have an egalitarian society, because we'll never have the ethos of justice that will incline people to go to the professions that they should, because they think that this is going to be socially beneficial, for as long as, of course, that it's providing with a reasonable measure of self-realization. Well, is the kind of society then that Cohen is imagining feasible? Well, it seems to me that what he's imagining in a way is a society in which self-interest is highly suppressed. Okay? And suppressed because people have essentially embraced a certain kind of ethos. Okay? They've embraced the kind of way of viewing themselves, viewing their behavior, viewing what is just. Okay? So, is this feasible to have a society of the kind that Cohen is imagining? Well, in some ways it's difficult to see how it would be consistent with a kind of market society, because it sounds as if a market society is one that in a way depends upon people responding to incentives of various kinds, depends on people making judgments about prices, choosing things that are cheaper over things that are more expensive. Okay? But at the back of Cohen's mind, I think, is the idea that all of this might be necessary to some degree, but nonetheless it's possible to have a society in which people acted in this way, doing all the things that are necessary to make a society economically productive, but nonetheless they don't resent money or income being taken away from them in order for it to be more equitably redistributed. Okay? Because what they embrace is the ethos of justice. What they'll do is they'll go into those professions that are socially productive, because in the end, what they recognize is that they shouldn't just be doing things for pure monetary gain. Can we imagine such a society? Well, there is such a society described by one political theorist whom Cohen is familiar with, and this is the Canadian philosopher Joseph Cairns, who in his book Equality, Economic Incentives in the Market imagines a society roughly of the following kind. You have a completely free market economy, but you have 100% taxation. Okay? And then the product of taxation is then redistributed more or less equally. Okay? Now, in this case, a market economy would operate. People would operate as if they had normal market incentives. They would make production, consumption, and work decisions on the basis of the returns that they're going to make from their economic activities. But in the end, whatever happens, they will be taxed at the rate of 100%, and then everything is to be redistributed in an equitable way. Now, I think, let's assume that this is perhaps the best we can get with respect to Cohen's concerns. Okay? That is to say, if we want a very high standard of living, and assume that the market society is going to produce this, and Cohen, I think, says some things that suggest that he no longer thinks that socialist economic planning is going to do the trick for us. We need some sort of market economy. So let's assume that the market economy will supply us with the higher standard of living. Now what we've got to assume is that this economy will operate with 100% taxation, redistribution of the gains from taxation, without any loss of the standard of living. Okay? Is this possible? Well, I think for this to be possible, what we would have to assume is that basically people will operate on the basis of the assumption that their pre-tax income is what should guide their choices or their decisions. Okay? What they'll think about when they're making their investment decisions, and their choices of work, choices of how long to labour, is the fact that they're going to get a higher pre-tax income, even though at the end of the day they're all going to get the same post-tax income. Okay? Now, my guess is that what this is assuming is that we can suppress self-interest to almost zero without any loss in people's in prosperity as a result of changes in people's behaviour. Okay? And I think this is where the Cohen view strikes a critical problem. It strikes this problem because it may well be the case that we can all operate with much less reliance or much less emphasis on our own self-interest. We might be able to think about how what we do benefits others to a much greater degree than we think. We might be able to act on our sense of right and wrong, but we all, to some degree, act on the basis of our own self-interest. For the kind of world that I'm describing, which I think is one approximation to the kind of society that Cohen is imagining, what we would have to have is a very different kind of being. Okay? And so the question is it reasonable to assume that this kind of being is plausible? I think at the back of Cohen's theory is the assumption that it is, that people can be not just a little bit different than they are now, that is to say they embrace a kind of ethos of justice, but they in fact embrace a very, very radical view, one that suppresses their own tendencies to prefer themselves in favour of an inclination to think much more expansively about the society as a whole. I don't want to say that people can't ever think about society as a whole, but they are going to have to be much more inclined to think about things other than themselves. Okay? Now, let me give you an example of a case which might arise in the kind of society that I'm thinking is consistent with Cohen's view, which suggests how difficult this might be. Okay? Let's imagine that you've got this society in which you have 100% taxation and redistribution, but in which people are free to choose their own occupations. Now, people would, if they think altruistically or non-egoistically, will think not only about their own self-realization, but also about what is going to be good for society more generally. And they wouldn't mind if the products of their hard work is taxed away and redistributed, because they're all good egalitarians who've embraced the ethos of justice. But you can imagine that, let's say some of them decide as a result of this to set up an enterprise, which I'll call the Poetry Co-op. Now, what they do in this society is they produce poetry. They set up a factory. I shouldn't call it factory. Collectivity or something, a workshop perhaps, where people work very hard and they write poetry. It gives them self-realization, but they also have to make money, so what they do is they hire poets, they produce books, and they sell them on the open market, subsidizing the unsung and unsold poets, but nonetheless being quite happy to socialize all the profits. Now you can imagine the problem here might be that there's just not enough profit in a poetry co-op. But in the society that we're imagining, this enterprise is probably not going to go out of business, because in the end, no matter how badly it does, all the gains from other enterprises are going to be redistributed by taxation, so that we have some kind of equality. No one is going to fall below a certain minimum. And of course, one possibility then is some unscrupulous people take advantage of this and just decide to become poets so that they can live a more relaxed life, sitting around writing poetry. But that's not the problem in Cohen's society, because there is an ethos of justice. People act for the right motives. They're not just going to do this to take advantage of others. This is not the kind of people they are. But the problem is that there may be more and more people, or at least too many people, who generally do think that poetry is useful, and are not deterred from doing this just because of the fact that it pays so badly and doesn't make any money. Now, if this is possible in this society, because the ethos of equality requires people not only to be able to go into those enterprises that they find rewarding, but also to subsidize, take care of those who aren't so fortunate in their capacity to produce, you're going to get a much higher number of people than you might like going to enterprises that are unproductive. Now, I don't want to say that everybody in the society is going to become a poet, far from it. But the point is that you don't need everyone to be doing this. Cohen's point is that you can have a society with justice, understood as equality, freedom of occupation, and a high standard of living, without any drop in the standard of living. And my point is that if you have these first two considerations in place, okay, then you're going to have, so rather, if you want to have these three considerations hold at the same time, equality, a high standard of living, and freedom of occupation, something's got to give. And in this case, what's going to give is the standard of living. Now, it may not drop by a lot. This is a contingent matter, but what he's got to assume is that it won't drop at all. There will be no fall. And I think this is simply an implausible kind of assumption to make. Now, how can he make this assumption? Well, he can only really make it if he really insists that somehow the ethos of egalitarianism will take hold. People will expect to be rewarded only for effort and for burdensome work, and they will choose socially less productive jobs only for reasons of self-realization. But even then, I think it's going to be very difficult. So everything hangs on the capacity to produce this ethos of justice. And even if you can produce this ethos, I think it's going to be difficult to maintain these three desiderata. Okay? I think there are a couple of other problems that I like to draw attention to as well. One of them goes back to the claim that people should be rewarded only for taking on more burdensome work or for putting in more effort, but not be rewarded for somehow being more talented or being more productive. This is just a matter of luck. And what I wonder is how easy is it to draw this distinction between reward for talent and reward for effort. Okay? So imagine the following case. Okay, let's say we've got the case of John, the superstar philosopher. Okay? John is someone who was very, very clever when he was at university, when he was working on his undergraduate studies and then his doctorate. He worked extremely hard, did very, very well, came up with a brilliant doctoral dissertation, got a good job at a research university with low teaching and high pay, lots of research opportunities, great students, good colleagues, and 20 years' time from then, he's enjoying the fruits of his labour. Okay. Now, I imagine another philosopher called Robert. Now, Robert is now a struggling philosopher. He was a contemporary of John's. But when he was a contemporary of John's at university, he didn't work nearly as hard, though he worked pretty hard. He found that at the end of the day, he did pretty well, but not nearly as well as John. We don't know whether he was just as talented. I tell these things, of course. His talent and work are not easy to disentangle, but in any case, at the end of his studies, he gets a less good job, and 20 years down the track, he's in a less good institution with longer hours, not such great students, less research opportunities, lower pay. Now, so if we're looking at this in time T2, John is doing much better than Robert. But is John being rewarded for his talents, or is he being rewarded for his efforts? Now, if you look at his current effort, John is actually working a lot less. But this is because of his investment efforts early on. He worked much harder than Robert early on in his career. Do we count current effort or investment effort, or do we count total lifetime effort? If you're going to distribute more only for effort, I wonder whether this is so straightforward a matter as the Cohen view seems to assume. So that's one concern that I have. The other concern I have is with this requirement that self-realization be recognized as a morally worthy end. Self-realization would justify you in taking the job as a gardener, but the desire for more money would not. And what I wonder is, why is that the case? Why is it that self-realization is given this privileged standing? I mean, after all, it is self-realization. What could be more selfish than that? Why is this somehow less ignoble than going for more money? Leaving aside the possibility that wealth might itself be a path to self-realization. Why does being willing to trade off some self-realization for more money mean that one doesn't care about self-realization? So I wonder about the emphasis on self-realization for a theory that's in the end purporting to be a socialist theory rather than an individualist one. That said, let me go back to Cohen's general theory. So the theory is that it is possible to have a society that's more equal, has the same standard of living, and that doesn't force people into labouring in jobs that they don't want. How is this possible? Well, he says it's only possible if people share an ethos of justice. If there isn't that ethos, then people simply won't do the work that's required. And what I wonder here is, what does it mean to say that there is this ethos? It seems to me that there are several problems here. Firstly, what we've got to figure out is what is the relevant distributive community over which there is an ethos. Now, in a market economy, which is highly diversified, crosses borders, it's made up of many different kinds of communities, from towns, cities, counties, countries, international organizations such as the EU, larger trading blocs. What is the relevant distributive community? I mean, I think this is going to make a big difference to the question of how the theory, in fact, operates. It's the reason for my being skeptical about the idea of an ethos of justice. The second thing is the size problem. If you're talking about an ethos, it seems to me that this is something that's relatively easy to achieve if you've got a very small group of people. The Libertarian Society may have a certain ethos, but of course once it opens its doors to a few other people, that ethos may be more difficult to sustain. You've got more people with a greater range of views, don't all see the world in quite the same way. So the size problem is going to make it much more difficult. And thirdly, there's the problem of diversity. For the Libertarian Society, it allows in people who have different ethical and political views. The ethos is not going to be the ethos of the Libertarian Society, it's going to be the ethos of some other more catch-all sort of society. Well, the same thing goes for societies more broadly speaking. It's made up of people of different religious affiliations, different cultural values, who have different ethical views. Well, having a common ethos may not be so straightforward a matter. Now, Cohen thinks that the ethos can be created. Okay? We can establish the requisite ethos to have this kind of society. What I want to suggest is that the facts of diversity, size, and of population mobility make this a very, very dubious undertaking. Changing the way people are, the way people think, I think is much more difficult than many people have thought in history. But this continues to be something that socialists, Marxists of all stripes continue to be attracted by. My guess is that this is simply a much more optimistic view about our technological capacity than is warranted. But let me finish then just with a couple of quick remarks then about what I think underpins this particular view of Cohen's, who in some ways abandoned his Marxism a long time ago as he became more interested in developing what looks like a more highly individualistic view of justice, doing it through criticizing thinkers like Rawls and Nozick, but not by advancing the classical Marxism that he once defended. But in another way, I think perhaps he hasn't departed so far from his Marxist roots. What's constant in all of this is the kind of view that self-interest is an undesirable thing, that it's not a permanent or ineradicable feature of human nature, that it is possible to bring about some kind of social transformation so that people have much higher levels of mutuality and fellow feeling. But what I want to end with is the thought that, while it may be possible to have a world in which people are much nicer to each other than they are now, much more concerned for each other than they are in many parts of the world, the theory of the kind that Cohen has presented to us, a very deep egalitarian theory, may require people to be not just a little bit nicer than they are now, a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more caring. It might actually require human beings to be much, much different than they are now. And if that's the case, it seems to me that the theory, in the end, is not going to stand up.